A weathered farmer stands before the board of directors in the gleaming headquarters of Lakeside Resort Properties, his calloused hands gripping a folder of environmental impact studies as security approaches to remove him. Just 1 week earlier, during the worst blizzard in decades, he had pulled a stranded executive's luxury SUV from a snowdrift, offering shelter in his modest farmhouse while the storm raged. Now facing the corporation that plans to drain the wetlands that sustain his family's organic cranberry farm, he must reveal evidence that could either save his community's watershed or cost him the legacy built by 4 generations of his family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Miller brushed snow from his worn canvas jacket as he studied the foreclosure notice that had arrived in that morning's mail. The January wind howled around the corners of the old farmhouse, rattling windows that had weathered a century of storms on the shores of Evergreen Lake. At 58, the deep lines etched across Thomas's face told the story of a life spent in partnership with the land, a partnership now threatened by forces beyond his control. The sprawling Miller family farm, with its 200 acres of organic cranberry bogs, vegetable fields, and protected wetlands, had been a fixture in Harborview County since Thomas's great-grandfather established it in 1896. What had once been a thriving operation, known throughout the Northeast for its sustainable practices and heirloom varieties, now teetered on the brink of financial collapse. Unlike the industrial cranberry operations that dominated the market with their chemical-intensive methods and mechanical harvesting, Thomas remained committed to the traditional, sustainable approach that his family had pioneered. Flooding the bogs naturally, harvesting by hand, and serving as stewards of the wetland ecosystem that made it all possible. When you grow food, you're not just feeding people today, you're borrowing the land from your grandchildren, his father used to say. Those words echoed in Thomas's mind as he folded the foreclosure notice and tucked it into the pocket of his flannel shirt. 60 days. That was all the time he had left before Northeast Agricultural Bank would claim the property. He walked toward the window, gazing out at the snow-covered bogs that stretched toward the frozen lake. The winter had been particularly harsh, with record-breaking cold snaps and heavy snowfall that had damaged several of the irrigation control structures. Repairs would cost thousands, money Thomas simply didn't have after 3 consecutive years of below-average harvests and rising costs. The farm equipment shed, once filled with well-maintained tractors and specialized bog equipment, now housed mostly aging machinery held together through Thomas's mechanical ingenuity and determination. The newer harvester, purchased 5 years ago with a loan he was still repaying, needed critical repairs before the next season. Every financial calculation led to the same grim conclusion. Without a significant change in circumstances, this would be the last winter the Miller family spent on their ancestral land. As Thomas started his morning chores, his thoughts turned to his daughter Rebecca, now a hydrologist with the State Environmental Protection Office. She had been monitoring concerning changes in the lake's water levels and quality, changes that coincided suspiciously with the expansion of Lakeside Resort Properties on the North Shore. The development company had transformed what was once a small vacation community into an expanding complex of luxury condominiums, a golf course, and a marina, all marketing the natural beauty they seemed intent on altering. Thomas's phone rang, breaking the morning stillness. It was Rebecca, calling earlier than usual. "Dad, those water samples from the northwestern wetlands came back," she began without preamble. "The results show elevated levels of nitrogen, phosphorus, and several construction chemicals. Something's disrupting the natural filtration system of the wetlands." "The resort's new golf course expansion?" Thomas asked, already suspecting the answer. "That's my guess," Rebecca confirmed. "They're supposed to have containment systems for all their runoff, but these numbers suggest they're cutting corners. The problem is proving it's them specifically and not from agricultural sources." "My bogs are certified organic," Thomas reminded her. "I haven't used chemical fertilizers in 20 years. "I know that, Dad, but Lakeside has 3 environmental lawyers on retainer who will immediately point to all the farms in the watershed. We need more specific evidence of the source." Thomas sighed, the weight of yet another challenge settling onto his already burdened shoulders. "I'll check the northern boundary today, see if I can spot anything unusual near their construction site." "Be careful," Rebecca warned. "Lakeside security has been aggressive about trespassing near their property lines. And Dad—" She hesitated. Have you made a decision about their offer?" The question made Thomas's jaw tighten. Lakeside had approached him 3 times in the past year with offers to purchase the Miller farm. The most recent proposal, while still well below the property's true value, would be enough to clear his debts and provide a modest retirement. It was tempting, especially as the financial vice continued to tighten. "It's not just about money, Beck," he said finally. "This land has been in our family for generations. The wetlands, the natural cranberry bogs, they're part of an ecosystem that's becoming increasingly rare. If Lakeside gets this property, they'll drain the bogs, fill in the wetlands and put up more condos, or extend that golf course. Everything your great-grandfather preserved would be gone." "I understand," Rebecca said softly. "Just don't wait until the bank makes the decision for you, okay?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After hanging up, Thomas pulled on his heaviest coat and headed out to inspect the northern boundary where his property met Lakeside's expanding development. The snow was deep, requiring snowshoes for the trek, but Thomas knew every inch of his land regardless of season. As he approached the boundary, marked by a line of old-growth maple trees, he could see heavy equipment tracks in the snow on Lakeside's side, bulldozers and excavators that had been busy despite the winter weather. What caught his attention, however, was a dark stain spreading across the pristine snow near one of the natural drainage channels that connected to his bogs. Following it to its source, he discovered a cracked containment basin on Lakeside's property, leaking construction chemicals and silt directly into the watershed that fed his cranberry bogs and ultimately flowed into Evergreen Lake. Thomas took photos with his phone, documenting the violation from his side of the property line. As he was photographing the spill, the distant sound of an engine struggling in deep snow caught his attention. Following the noise, he spotted a luxury SUV stuck in a drift on the old access road that ran along the eastern edge of his property. The vehicle was clearly expensive, a late-model Range Rover with city plates, and utterly unsuited for the unplowed back roads during a blizzard. Thomas shook his head at the driver's poor judgment, but began making his way toward the stranded vehicle. Despite his own troubles, he couldn't leave someone stuck in these dangerous temperatures. As he approached, he saw a man in what appeared to be an expensive but completely inadequate winter coat, trying unsuccessfully to dig the SUV out with what looked like a small emergency shovel. "Need some help?" Thomas called out, his voice nearly lost in the howling wind. The driver straightened, relief visible on his face, despite his obvious frustration and discomfort. "God, yes," he replied, stamping his feet against the cold. "GPS routed me this way as a shortcut to Lakeside Resort. Clearly a mistake." Thomas noted the connection to Lakeside, but didn't comment on it. Those navigation systems don't account for unplowed roads. You're about 3 miles from the resort, but you won't make it in that. He gestured to the buried SUV. "I'm Thomas Miller. My farmhouse is about half a mile back. I can pull you out with my tractor, and you can warm up while I call the resort to send their snow vehicle for you." The man extended a gloved hand. "James Westbrook, I cannot tell you how grateful I am. I've been trying to get a signal to call for help, but there's nothing out here." "Cell coverage is spotty in the best conditions," Thomas explained, already assessing how to extract the vehicle. "During a storm like this, forget it. Wait here while I get the tractor." As Thomas trudged back to the farm through thickening snow, he wondered about the stranded executive. The name Westbrook sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. Within 30 minutes, he returned with his ancient but reliable Kubota tractor. Using chains and his experienced handling of the equipment, he gradually freed the Range Rover from the snowdrift. "It's impressive you know how to do this," Westbrook commented, watching Thomas work with obvious respect. "When you farm in a place with 6 months of winter, you learn how to handle snow," Thomas replied, securing the chains. "But your vehicle isn't going anywhere until the plows come through, which won't be until tomorrow at the earliest. You'd better come back to the house." Westbrook hesitated only briefly before grabbing a sleek leather briefcase and a small overnight bag from his SUV. "Lead the way, and thank you. I was starting to worry about how cold it was getting." The trek back to the farmhouse gave Thomas a chance to observe his unexpected guest. Despite his inadequate winter gear, James Westbrook moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to navigating challenging situations, though perhaps not usually physical ones. He asked intelligent questions about the farm as they walked, showing more genuine interest than Thomas would have expected from someone clearly from an urban environment. As they reached the farmhouse, the wind picked up dramatically, visibility dropping to near zero as the blizzard intensified. Thomas led Westbrook inside, the warmth of the wood-burning stove a welcome relief from the biting cold. "Make yourself comfortable," Thomas offered, taking Westbrook's coat. "I'll make some coffee and call the resort to let them know where you although I doubt they'll be sending anyone until this passes." Westbrook glanced out the window at the whiteout conditions and nodded. "I think you're right. I apologize for imposing on you like this." "It's nothing," Thomas assured him. "We don't leave people stranded in weather like this. It's not just neighborly. It's survival." While Thomas made coffee, Westbrook took in the farmhouse's interior. Despite its age and obvious need for repairs, the home had a worn dignity to it. Handcrafted furniture passed down through generations, walls lined with agricultural awards and family photographs documenting over a century of Miller family history on the land. "Your family has been here a long time," Westbrook observed, studying a black-and-white photograph of what must have been Thomas's great-grandfather, standing proudly beside the original cranberry bog. "Since 1896, Thomas confirmed, bringing 2 mugs of coffee to the kitchen table. My great-grandfather was one of the first to cultivate cranberries in this region. He recognized that the natural wetlands here created perfect conditions. Westbrook nodded thoughtfully, adaptively using the natural environment rather than forcing it to change. Smart. Something in his tone made Thomas look more closely at his guest. You know something about agriculture? Not specifically, Westbrook admitted, but I've worked extensively with land development and resource management. The most successful long-term projects work with natural systems rather than against them. The comment surprised Thomas, who had assumed someone associated with Lakeside Resort would have a more conventional development mindset. That's not the approach I've seen from most developers in the area, he remarked carefully. Westbrook's response was interrupted by the farmhouse phone ringing. It was the resort's guest services manager confirming what they already suspected. No one would be able to retrieve Westbrook until the storm cleared, likely sometime the following day. The roads were officially closed, with emergency vehicles being the only exception. Looks like you're stuck with me for the night, Westbrook said after Thomas hung up. I'm truly sorry for the imposition. Thomas waved away the apology. The guest room is small but comfortable. I keep it ready for when my daughter visits. He hesitated, then added, I should warn you, we might lose power as this storm worsens. It happens pretty regularly out here. I'm just grateful not to be freezing in my car, Westbrook replied. Whatever accommodations you can offer are far better than the alternative. As they settled in for what would clearly be an extended stay, Thomas prepared a simple but hearty meal of homemade venison stew and fresh bread, food grown or hunted on the farm itself. Over dinner, the conversation flowed more easily than either man might have expected, given their obviously different backgrounds. Westbrook proved to be knowledgeable about a surprisingly wide range of topics, from environmental conservation to rural economic challenges. He listened with genuine interest as Thomas explained the traditional cranberry cultivation methods his family had refined over generations, as well as the increasing difficulties of maintaining a small organic operation in a market dominated by corporate producers. The irony is that demand for organic, sustainably grown food has never been higher, Thomas explained, but the economic pressures on small farmers have never been worse. People want the product, but they don't understand the true cost of growing food in harmony with nature. It's the disconnect between consumers and producers, Westbrook agreed. People want sustainability in principle, but balk at paying what it actually costs. Thomas nodded, surprised by Westbrook's understanding. Exactly. Meanwhile, banks only care about quarterly profits, not 100-year agricultural legacies or ecological balance. As the evening progressed, Thomas found himself sharing more than he had intended about his current situation, the looming foreclosure, the declining harvests, the pressure from Lakeside to sell. He didn't mention his suspicions about the chemical runoff, however, still unsure of exactly who his guest was or his connection to the resort. Westbrook listened attentively, asking occasional questions that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of agricultural economics and land use issues. When Thomas mentioned the foreclosure deadline, something flickered in Westbrook's expression. Not pity, which Thomas would have resented, but what seemed like genuine concern mixed with calculation. 60 days isn't much time, Westbrook observed. What options are you considering? Thomas sighed, the weight of his situation settling back onto his shoulders after the brief respite of conversation. Limited ones. The bank wants $350,000, which is impossible to raise from a single cranberry harvest, even in a good year. Equipment is too old to fetch much. The land itself is the only real asset. And Lakeside wants to buy it? Westbrook stated, rather than asked. They've made offers, Thomas acknowledged. None that reflect its true value, either financially or ecologically. This isn't just land, it's a functioning wetland system, a wildlife habitat, part of what keeps Evergreen Lake healthy. But they see it as just another place to put condos and expand their golf course. Westbrook's eyes narrowed slightly. They want to develop the wetlands? That seems short-sighted, even from a business perspective. Those natural systems provide water filtration and flood control that benefit the entire area, including their existing properties. The sophisticated understanding of ecological services caught Thomas off guard. That's exactly right. But they don't seem to take the long view. As predicted, the power went out around 10 o'clock. The farmhouse suddenly plunged into darkness, broken only by the orange glow of the wood stove. Thomas calmly lit several oil lamps, the routine familiar after years of winter power outages. The storm outside had intensified, wind howling around the old farmhouse, and snow accumulating rapidly. "Does this happen often?" Westbrook asked, helping Thomas position the lamps. "Every big storm," Thomas confirmed. "The backup generator keeps the critical systems running, heat, well pump, refrigeration. But we use the lamps to save fuel. The power company does their best, but rural areas aren't exactly their priority for restoration." As they sat by the stove's warmth, conversation turned to Thomas's daughter Rebecca and her work in environmental hydrology. Thomas spoke proudly of her research on wetland systems and water quality, careful not to mention her specific concerns about Lakeside's development practices. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Westbrook commented. "Following in the family tradition of stewardship, just through science rather than direct farming." "She sees the bigger picture," Thomas agreed. "How everything connects, the farms, the wetlands, the lake, the community. That's getting rarer these days when most people just see pieces in isolation." The conversation continued late into the night, ranging across topics from rural community challenges to climate change impacts on agriculture. Despite their different backgrounds and circumstances, Thomas found in Westbrook an unexpectedly thoughtful conversation partner, someone who asked insightful questions and listened carefully to the answers. When they finally turned in for the night, Thomas, lying in his familiar bed listening to the storm raging outside, he reflected on the strange circumstances that had brought this urban executive into his home. There was something about James Westbrook that didn't quite fit the stereotype of the corporate businessman, a depth of understanding about environmental systems and rural challenges that seemed unusual. Still, Thomas reminded himself, one thoughtful conversation didn't change the fundamental realities he faced. In the morning, Westbrook would return to his world of luxury resorts and boardrooms, while Thomas would continue his increasingly desperate struggle to save his family's legacy. What Thomas couldn't know as he drifted off to sleep was that this chance encounter during a blizzard would catalyze a chain of events that would transform not just his own circumstances, but potentially the future of the entire Evergreen Lake watershed. The man sleeping in his guest room was far more than he appeared, with connections and resources that would prove either the salvation or the final nail in the coffin of the Miller family farm, depending on choices both men would make in the coming days. The following morning dawned clear and blindingly bright, the storm having passed during the night to leave behind nearly 2 feet of fresh snow that transformed the landscape into a glistening white expanse. Thomas was already up and tending to essential farm tasks when Westbrook emerged from the guest room, looking remarkably composed despite the circumstances. "Power's still out," Thomas informed him, pouring coffee from a pot he'd heated on the wood stove. "But the road crews should be working their way out here by midday. I got through to the resort on the emergency landline. They're sending their snow vehicle as soon as the main roads are passable." "I appreciate everything, Thomas," Westbrook said, accepting the coffee. "You've shown extraordinary hospitality to a complete stranger." Through the kitchen window, they could see the stunning beauty of the snow-covered farm, the cranberry bogs now smooth white expanses stretching toward the frozen lake, the wetlands a complex pattern of white frosted vegetation and ice-rimmed pools. The rising sun cast everything in a golden light that highlighted the natural contours of the land. "It's breathtaking," Westbrook remarked, gazing out at the view. "You can see the natural water patterns even under the snow." The observation, again showing unexpected environmental literacy, reinforced Thomas's sense that there was more to his guest than was immediately apparent. Before he could respond, the sound of an approaching engine broke the morning stillness. Through the window, they could see a large snowmobile with the Lakeside Resort logo making its way up the long driveway. "Your ride's here," Thomas observed, feeling a strange reluctance to see his unexpected guest depart. Westbrook gathered his belongings, then turned to Thomas with unexpected seriousness. "I'd like to continue our conversation about sustainable agriculture and wetland conservation. Would you be willing to meet me at the resort later this week? Say Thursday afternoon?" The request caught Thomas off guard. What exactly would we be discussing? "Ideas that might be mutually beneficial," Westbrook replied, handing Thomas a business card. "No commitments. Just a conversation." Thomas looked down at the card and for the first time understood why Westbrook's name had seemed vaguely familiar. The card read, "James Westbrook, CEO, Westbrook Environmental Development Group." Below that was a tagline, "Sustainable Solutions for Natural Systems." "You're not with Lakeside Resort," Thomas said, the pieces suddenly clicking into place. Westbrook smiled slightly. "No, though they've been expecting me. My company is evaluating potential partnership opportunities in the region. Our specialty is environmentally integrated development that preserves and enhances natural systems rather than destroying them." Before Thomas could fully process this revelation, the snowmobile driver knocked on the door. Westbrook shook Thomas's hand firmly. "Thursday at 2, sir. The resort has a private conference room we can use." Still somewhat bewildered by this turn of events, Thomas nodded. "I'll be there." As the snowmobile disappeared down the driveway, Thomas stood in the doorway, the business card still in his hand, wondering what exactly had just transpired and what it might mean for the future of the farm. An idea began to form in his mind. one that seemed impossible yet somehow, after the conversations of the previous evening, not entirely beyond imagination. That afternoon, with power restored and the main roads cleared enough for careful travel, Thomas drove to his daughter's office at the State Environmental Protection Headquarters in the county seat. He needed to better understand who exactly James Westbrook was before walking into a meeting that might represent his last hope or simply another dead end in his fight to save the farm. Rebecca looked up from her computer as Thomas entered her office, surprise evident on her face. "Dad, I didn't expect to see you in town today after that storm." Thomas placed Westbrook's business card on her desk. "I need to know what you can tell me about this company and the man who runs it." Rebecca picked up the card, her eyebrows rising as she read it. "Westbrook Environmental Development? They're major players in the sustainable development field. How did you get this?" "James Westbrook spent last night at the farm," Thomas explained, settling into the chair across from her desk. "His SUV got stuck during the blizzard. We talked for hours, and he's asked me to meet him at Lakeside Resort on Thursday." Rebecca's expression shifted from surprise to intense interest. "Dad, this is potentially significant. Westbrook's company has revolutionized how resort development interacts with natural environments. They're known for projects that integrate with and even enhance existing ecosystems rather than bulldozing them." She turned to her computer, typing rapidly. "Their Coastal Pines project in Maine preserved 80% of the natural wetlands while creating an eco-resort that actually improved water quality in the adjacent bay. And their Mountain Springs development in Colorado restored a damaged watershed, while building a ski resort that operates with minimal environmental impact." Thomas leaned forward, hope cautiously building. "What would someone like that want with our farm?" "I'm not sure," Rebecca admitted, scrolling through more information. "But there are rumors that Westbrook is looking to establish a flagship project in the Northeast that demonstrates how tourism and agriculture can coexist with ecological restoration. Your farm's location and your sustainable practices might fit their model. Or he could be working with Lakeside to acquire more property," Thomas countered, his farmer's caution reasserting itself. Rebecca shook her head firmly. "Westbrook and Lakeside have fundamentally different approaches. In fact," she hesitated, then continued, "the Environmental Protection Office has been monitoring several concerning practices at Lakeside's current development. If Westbrook is meeting with them, it might actually be to address those issues." Thomas thought about the chemical runoff he'd photographed. Like containment basin failures that leak construction chemicals into neighboring wetlands. Rebecca's eyes widened. "You found something?" Thomas showed her the photos on his phone. "Yesterday, before finding Westbrook. The runoff is flowing directly into the drainage system that feeds our bogs." Rebecca studied the images intently. "This is exactly the kind of documentation we need. With these photos and our water quality data, we might have enough to issue violations against Lakeside for Clean Water Act infringements." "Would that stop their expansion plans?" Thomas asked. "It could certainly delay them and force better containment systems," Rebecca replied. "But it won't solve your foreclosure situation, Dad." Thomas nodded grimly. "No, but it might buy us time to find a solution." He didn't voice the small hope beginning to form, that perhaps James Westbrook and his company might represent that solution. "Let me run these images through our system and attach them to our case file," Rebecca said. "And Dad, be careful at that meeting on Thursday. Lakeside's management won't be happy if they find out you've been documenting their environmental violations. The drive back to the farm gave Thomas time to consider the possibilities ahead. For the first time in months, a tiny flame of hope flickered within him. If Westbrook's company was genuinely interested in sustainable development that preserved agricultural operations and natural systems, perhaps there was a path forward that didn't end with either bank foreclosure or selling to Lakeside's destructive vision. When Thursday arrived, Thomas dressed in his best clothes, which meant his newest jeans, a plaid shirt without any patches, and the wool jacket he wore for special occasions. He brought with him his farm's most recent soil and water, test results, organic certification documents, and historical records of the property's role in the watershed ecosystem. If this meeting represented even a sliver of opportunity, he would be prepared. The stark contrast between his weathered pickup truck and the luxury vehicles in the Lakeside Resort parking lot couldn't have been more pronounced. As Thomas entered, the gleaming lobby, with its soaring glass walls overlooking Evergreen Lake, he felt conspicuously out of place among the wealthy tourists in designer ski wear and resort staff in crisp uniforms. At the reception desk, he stated his business. "I'm here to meet James Westbrook. He's expecting me." The receptionist's initial dismissive glance transformed into professional courtesy when she confirmed his appointment. "Mr. Westbrook is in the Pine Room Conference Center. Joshua will escort you." A young staff member led Thomas through the resort's main building, past upscale restaurants and boutique shops, to a corridor housing private meeting spaces. When Joshua opened the door to the Pine Room, Thomas was surprised to find not just James Westbrook, but a small gathering of people seated around a conference table. Westbrook rose immediately, coming forward to greet Thomas with genuine warmth. "Thomas, thank you for coming. Please join us." As introductions were made, Thomas quickly assessed the group. Besides Westbrook, there was a woman introduced as Dr. Elaine Cho, Westbrook's Environmental Science Director, Michael Patel, the company's Chief Financial Officer, and to Thomas's surprise, Richard Davis, the CEO of Lakeside Resort Properties. Davis's presence immediately put Thomas on guard. The resort's CEO was known throughout the community for his aggressive expansion plans and dismissive attitude toward local concerns. His handshake was perfunctory, his smile not reaching his eyes as he nodded to Thomas. "Mr. Miller, interesting to finally meet the man who's been so resistant to progress." Before Thomas could formulate a response to the thinly veiled hostility, Westbrook smoothly intervened. "Thomas has been maintaining one of the most ecologically significant properties in the watershed, Richard. I'd call that the very definition of progress, sustainable stewardship across generations." The subtle rebuke established the dynamic in the room more clearly than any formal statement could have. Westbrook had invited Thomas as a valued potential, a partner, not as an adversary to be overcome. Davis's expression tightened, but he said nothing further as they all took their seats. "Thomas," Westbrook began, "I asked you here because what I saw at your farm represents exactly the kind of integrated agricultural and ecological system that our company seeks to preserve and enhance in our development projects. After our conversation, I spent the past 2 days researching your property's history and significance to the regional watershed." Dr. Cho opened a laptop, bringing up detailed maps of the Evergreen Lake watershed with the Miller Farm highlighted. "Your property contains some of the most effective natural filtration wetlands in the entire system," she explained. Our preliminary analysis suggests that the cranberry bogs and associated wetlands on your farm filter approximately 30% of the water flowing into the northeast quadrant of the lake, removing sediments and naturally processing nutrients that would otherwise cause algal blooms and degradation. Michael Patel continued, from an ecosystem services perspective, the natural capital of your property's filtration function alone is worth millions, far more than its assessed real estate value. Thomas glanced at Davis, who was becoming visibly uncomfortable with the direction of the presentation. If that's true, Thomas asked, why has Lakeside been so intent on acquiring the property to drain the bogs and fill the wetlands? Davis shifted in his chair. Those plans were preliminary, concepts, not finalized designs. We've always intended to maintain some natural features. That's not consistent with the development proposals I've seen, Thomas countered, thinking of the detailed plans Rebecca had obtained through public records requests, plans that showed complete drainage of the wetlands and regrading of the entire property for additional condominiums and golf course expansion. Westbrook intervened smoothly, which is precisely why we're all here today. Westbrook Environmental Development is considering a major investment in the Evergreen Lake region, but only if development proceeds in a way that enhances rather than degrades the natural systems that make this area special. He turned to a large screen on the wall, which displayed a new vision for the area, one dramatically different from Lakeside's previous plans. We're proposing a partnership approach that would integrate the existing resort with the natural and agricultural heritage of the region, creating what we call a living landscape where visitors can experience authentic connections to both the environment and local food production. The concept images showed Lakeside Resort reimagined with green infrastructure, restored shorelines, and reduced footprint. Most surprisingly, they showed the Miller Farm not only preserved, but enhanced as a centerpiece of the new vision. The cranberry bogs and wetlands maintained in their natural state, with unobtrusive boardwalks allowing resort guests to experience the unique ecosystem, and the historic farmhouse, renovated as an education center and farm-to-table restaurant showcase. Our company would purchase a controlling interest in Lakeside Resort Properties, Westbrook explained, and simultaneously establish a conservation partnership with the Miller Farm that would maintain your ownership and operational authority while providing capital for modernization, debt relief, and ecological enhancement. Thomas stared at the images on the screen, scarcely able to believe what he was hearing. You want to preserve the farm rather than develop it? Exactly, Westbrook confirmed. Our business model demonstrates that integrated, environmentally sensitive tourism generates more sustainable profits than conventional development. Guests are increasingly seeking authentic experiences and connections to the places they visit, not just another golf course or condominium complex that could be anywhere. Thomas glanced at Davis, whose expression had hardened into barely concealed anger. This represents a significant departure from Lakeside's established development strategy, Davis said tightly. It does, Westbrook agreed without apology, which is why our potential investment would be contingent on full adoption of this new approach, including immediate remediation of the environmental issues we've identified in current operations. The pointed reference made Davis's jaw clench, but he remained silent, clearly unwilling to challenge Westbrook directly given the significant investment being discussed. What exactly would this partnership mean for me and the farm? Thomas asked, still cautious, despite the promising vision. Dr. Cho took the lead. Your operation would continue as an organic cranberry producer with additional capital for modernization and expanded capacity. We'd establish a formal ecosystem services payment system that compensates you for the water filtration and habitat functions your wetlands provide. The farm would become a centerpiece of the visitor experience, with opportunities for agricultural tourism that would create additional revenue streams. Patel added the financial specifics. The initial investment would include complete resolution of your current bank obligations, capital improvements to infrastructure, and establishment of a conservation easement that would permanently protect the wetlands and bogs from future development while maintaining your ownership of the property. It sounded too good to be true, which immediately triggered Thomas's natural skepticism. Why would you do this, rather than simply developing the property more profitably? Because truly profitable development in the 21st century must be sustainable, in every sense of the word, Westbrook replied. Environmental degradation creates hidden costs that eventually undermine financial returns. We've demonstrated in multiple projects that our approach yields superior long-term results, both ecologically and financially. He handed Thomas a folder containing detailed projections, case studies from other Westbrook environmental projects, and a preliminary partnership agreement. I don't expect a decision today. Review these materials. Discuss them with your daughter. Consult legal counsel. We're prepared to move forward when you're ready. Davis abruptly stood. I think we should discuss this privately before proceeding further. Mr. Miller, thank you for your time. The dismissal was obvious, but Westbrook countered it immediately. Actually, Richard, Thomas and I have some additional matters to discuss. Would you mind giving us the room? Elaine and Michael can address any immediate questions you have about the proposal. The power dynamic was unmistakable. Despite Davis technically being the CEO of Lakeside, it was clear that Westbrook held the stronger position. With poorly concealed frustration, Davis left with the other Westbrook executives, leaving Thomas and James Westbrook alone in the conference room. Once the door closed, Westbrook's formal business demeanor relaxed slightly. I apologize for the tension. Richard Davis represents an older model of development that prioritizes immediate returns over long-term sustainability. He's resistant to change, but the financial realities will likely convince him. Or you'll find another resort to partner with, Thomas observed shrewdly. Westbrook smiled. You understand leverage. Yes, while Lakeside has an established presence here, there are other opportunities in the region. But the Miller farm is unique. Its location, its history, and most importantly, its careful stewardship under your family's management make it irreplaceable. He walked to the window, gesturing toward the lake and the land beyond. When I found myself stranded at your farm, it was initially just an inconvenience, but that evening, listening to you describe your family's connection to the land and your sustainable practices, I recognized something increasingly rare in today's world: genuine, intergenerational stewardship. That's something our company values deeply and seeks to preserve wherever we find it. Thomas joined him at the window, looking out at the frozen expanse of Evergreen Lake. I've spent my entire life protecting this small piece of the world, because my father and his father before him understood its value beyond mere dollars. When you've watched cranberries ripen in bogs your great-grandfather created, worked with wetland systems that have functioned for centuries, you develop a different perspective on development and progress. Exactly, Westbrook agreed. True. Progress enhances what's valuable rather than destroying it. The model we're proposing would allow your family legacy to continue while addressing the economic realities that threaten it. Thomas appreciated the candor. And what happens with the environmental violations my daughter's office is investigating? The containment failures I photographed? If Westbrook was surprised by Thomas's direct approach, he didn't show it. I'm aware of those issues. Part of our agreement with Lakeside would include immediate remediation of all existing environmental problems and implementation of strict protocols to prevent future occurrences. Your documentation has actually strengthened our negotiating position considerably. The revelation confirmed what Thomas had begun to suspect, that Westbrook was using the environmental violations as leverage in his negotiations with Lakeside, while simultaneously offering Thomas a lifeline that might save the farm. It was a sophisticated strategy that served multiple interests simultaneously. There's one other matter, Westbrook continued, his tone becoming more personal. Your daughter Rebecca's research on wetland systems and water quality is exceptional. Our company maintains a research division focused on ecological function and restoration. We'd be interested in discussing potential collaboration opportunities with her, though obviously that would be her decision entirely and separate from our arrangements regarding the farm. The mention of Rebecca brought Thomas's thoughts back to his daughter's concerns about conflicting interests. She works for the State Environmental Protection Office. There would be obvious ethical considerations. Of course, Westbrook acknowledged. I'm not suggesting anything improper. Rather, I'm noting that her expertise aligns with our company's research priorities. It would be entirely her choice whether to explore those synergies in the future. As their meeting concluded, Westbrook handed Thomas one final document, a letter confirming Westbrook Environmental's intent to establish a conservation partnership that would resolve the farm's financial challenges while preserving its ecological functions. This should satisfy your bank that a solution is imminent, buying you time to review the full proposal. Thomas accepted the letter, still somewhat dazed by how dramatically his prospects had shifted in the space of a single week. From facing imminent foreclosure to potentially partnering with a company that valued exactly what he had spent his life protecting. I'll need time to consider all this, Thomas said, tucking the folder under his arm. Absolutely, Westbrook agreed. This is a significant decision affecting your family's legacy. Take the time you need to ensure it's the right path forward. As Thomas left the resort and climbed into his weathered pickup truck, he felt a complex mix of emotions, hope tempered by caution, excitement balanced with skepticism, and beneath it all, a profound sense that perhaps the values his family had maintained for generations might finally be recognized, not as obstacles to progress, but as essential components of a more enlightened definition of development. What he couldn't yet know was that the partnership Westbrook proposed was merely the beginning of a transformation that would extend far beyond his own farm, one that would challenge fundamental assumptions about the relationship between economic development, environmental protection, and agricultural heritage throughout the region. The path ahead would not be without conflict, as those committed to older models of development would not easily surrender their vision for Evergreen Lake and the surrounding community. Thomas drove directly from Lakeside Resort to Rebecca's apartment in town, the folder of materials from Westbrook Environmental Development secured on the passenger seat beside him. His mind raced with possibilities, analyzing the proposal from every angle, searching for hidden pitfalls or overlooked consequences. Years of watching neighboring farms fall to development had taught him to approach any corporate interest with healthy skepticism. Yet Westbrook's vision was unlike anything he'd encountered before. Rebecca answered her door, still dressed in her work clothes, surprise evident on her face. "Dad, I wasn't expecting you tonight." "I just came from the meeting with Westbrook," Thomas explained, stepping into her small but tidy apartment. "I need your perspective on this." He handed her the folder, watching as she leafed through the contents with growing astonishment. "This is remarkable," she said finally, looking up from a detailed map showing the proposed conservation zones and agricultural preservation areas. "It's completely counter to everything Lakeside has been planning. They want to maintain the wetlands intact and continue cranberry production. Apparently our bogs and wetlands are more valuable functioning naturally than filled in for condos and golf courses," Thomas said, still finding the concept somewhat difficult to believe. "Westbrook calls it natural capital and ecosystem services, the idea that healthy natural systems provide economic benefits worth preserving." Rebecca nodded energetically. "That's exactly what my research demonstrates. The filtration capacity of your wetlands provides services that would cost millions to replace with engineered solutions." She spread several documents across her dining table. "They've even calculated the carbon sequestration value of the peat bogs. This is cutting-edge ecological economics." "But is it legitimate?" Thomas asked, the question that had been nagging at him since leaving the resort. "Can we trust that this isn't just a more sophisticated way to eventually push us out?" Rebecca studied the legal language in the preliminary agreement. The conservation easement they're proposing would permanently protect the wetlands and bogs from development, regardless of ownership changes, and they're offering to clear the bank debt while maintaining your operational control of the agricultural components. She looked up at her father, excitement growing in her eyes. "Dad, this could be the solution we've been searching for. A way to save the farm without compromising the environmental values our family has always stood for." "It seems too perfect," Thomas said, voicing his lingering doubts. "What's the catch?" "Let me make some calls," Rebecca replied. "I know people who've worked with Westbrook Environmental on other projects. We need first-hand accounts of how they operate after the initial agreements are signed." Over the next several days, Thomas and Rebecca conducted extensive research on Westbrook Environmental Development. They spoke with farmers in Vermont who had entered similar conservation partnerships, environmental officials who had monitored Westbrook projects in other states, and even an attorney specializing in conservation law who reviewed the preliminary agreement. The consistent picture that emerged was encouraging. While not without occasional tensions, Westbrook's projects generally fulfilled their promises of balancing economic development with environmental protection and cultural preservation. Most importantly, in cases involving agricultural operations, the company had maintained its commitments to local farmers, honoring both the letter and spirit of their agreements. 5 days after the meeting at Lakeside Resort, Thomas received an unexpected visitor at the farm. Richard Davis's luxury sedan looked out of place in the rutted farm driveway as he stepped out, his expensive overcoat inappropriate for the muddy conditions created by the melting snow. "Mr. Miller," Davis called, approaching where Thomas was repairing an irrigation control structure. "I think we need to talk man to man, without all the corporate presentations and fancy concepts." Thomas set down his tools, wiping his hands on a rag. "What about?" "This Westbrook proposal," Davis said, glancing with evident distaste at the muddy boots and weathered equipment that characterized the working farm. "I understand how it might seem attractive on the surface, but there are realities you should consider before making any commitments." "What realities would those be?" Thomas asked, keeping his tone neutral despite his immediate wariness. Davis gestured broadly toward the property. "Westbrook's proposal is based on theoretical models and projective economics. The reality is that maintaining these wetlands and continuing cranberry production is significantly less profitable than our original development plan. Eventually, financial pressures will force them to modify their approach." "The conservation easement would prevent that," Thomas pointed out. Davis smiled thinly. "Legal protections can be reinterpreted over time. What I'm offering is certainty. A clean, straightforward purchase at a price that's now 15% higher than our previous offer. No complicated partnerships, no ongoing obligations, just a straightforward transaction that gives you a fresh start elsewhere." He handed Thomas an envelope. "Our final offer, considerably more generous than before, but it expires in 48 hours. After that, we'll focus our acquisition efforts on other properties in our development zone." The implicit threat was clear. If Thomas partnered with Westbrook, Lakeside would intensify development on surrounding properties, potentially creating problems for the farm through runoff, water access issues, and other indirect pressures. "I'll consider it," Thomas said simply, accepting the envelope but making no commitment. Davis nodded, clearly believing his position stronger than it actually was. "Practical solutions are usually better than idealistic ones, Mr. Miller. The development of this area is inevitable. The only question is whether you benefit from it or become collateral damage." After Davis departed, Thomas immediately called Rebecca to share the details of the conversation. "He's desperate," Rebecca concluded after hearing Thomas's account. "Westbrook's interest has completely disrupted Lakeside's expansion plans. They're trying to secure your property quickly before the Westbrook partnership is finalized. Or they're right that Westbrook's approach isn't economically sustainable in the long run," Thomas countered, giving voice to his lingering doubts. "Dad, all my research indicates Westbrook's model is actually more sustainable financially because it creates unique value that can't be replicated by generic developments," Rebecca insisted. "Generic condos and golf courses are everywhere, but an authentic, ecologically rich experience connected to local agricultural traditions, that's increasingly rare and valuable." Thomas thought about this perspective as he walked the boundaries of his property that evening, watching the sunset reflect on the partially thawed cranberry bogs. 4 generations of his family had maintained this land, adapting to changing conditions while preserving its essential character and ecological functions. The choice he now faced would determine whether that legacy continued or ended with him. The following morning, Thomas received a call from James Westbrook. "I understand Richard Davis made a personal visit to your property yesterday," Westbrook said without preamble. Thomas wasn't surprised that Westbrook had this information. In small communities, such things rarely remain private for long. He made an increased offer with a short deadline. As expected, Westbrook replied calmly. When traditional developers face our model of integrated conservation and development, they typically respond with aggressive acquisition attempts. It validates that our approach threatens their conventional business model. And if I took their offer, Thomas asked, testing Westbrook's reaction, then we would need to significantly modify our plans for the region, Westbrook answered candidly. Your property's ecological functions are central to our vision, but ultimately that would be your choice to make based on what you believe best serves your interests and values. The lack of pressure or manipulation in Westbrook's response further increased Thomas's growing confidence in his integrity. I've done extensive research on your company over the past week, Thomas said. Your track record seems consistent with the vision you've presented. I'm pleased to hear that, Westbrook replied. We work hard to ensure our actions align with our stated principles. It's the only way to build the trust necessary for truly successful partnerships. By the time Davis's 48-hour deadline expired, Thomas had made his decision. He would decline Lakeside's buyout offer and proceed with the Westbrook partnership. However, events were already in motion that would dramatically alter the dynamics of the situation. That evening, Rebecca arrived at the farm with startling news. The Environmental Protection Office received an anonymous digital file today containing internal Lakeside Resort documents, she explained, her expression a mix of professional concern and personal vindication. They detail a deliberate strategy to acquire properties in the watershed by artificially creating financial pressures on landowners. What kind of pressures? Thomas asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. Various methods depending on the property, Rebecca explained, spreading printouts on the kitchen table. For some, they manipulated water access through regulatory challenges. For others, they created drainage issues that reduced agricultural productivity. She pointed to a section that mentioned the Miller farm specifically. In your case, they deliberately designed their stormwater management system to channel construction runoff toward your property, knowing it would eventually impact crop yields. There are actual engineering documents showing how they modified the containment systems to allow controlled releases during heavy rain events, exactly what you photographed. Thomas felt a cold anger building as he examined the documents. This is criminal environmental sabotage. Exactly, Rebecca confirmed. The Environmental Protection Office has already forwarded these materials to the State Attorney General and the EPA. Lakeside is facing potential criminal charges for Clean Water Act violations, fraud, and environmental crimes. Who provided these documents? Thomas asked. Rebecca shook her head. Completely anonymous through encrypted channels, but they're authenticated by digital signatures and metadata. Someone inside Lakeside with high-level access clearly decided to blow the whistle. The revelation transformed the situation entirely. What had been a private decision about the farm's future now had public implications that could affect the entire region's development trajectory. If Lakeside Resort faced criminal prosecution and significant fines, their existing operations would be jeopardized, potentially creating an opening for Westbrook's alternative vision to gain broader acceptance. The following morning, an emergency meeting was convened at the county offices. Representatives from the State Environmental Protection Office, local government officials, and affected landowners gathered to discuss the implications of the Lakeside documents. Thomas attended as both a potentially affected property owner and as the source of photographic evidence that corroborated the document claims. The atmosphere was tense as the environmental officials outlined the allegations against Lakeside Resort and the preliminary enforcement actions being initiated. Several landowners who had sold to Lakeside under duress now questioned whether they had legal recourse to challenge those transactions. Midway through the meeting, James Westbrook arrived, accompanied by his environmental science director, Dr. Cho, and several attorneys. Their presence immediately shifted the dynamic of the gathering. Westbrook Environmental Development has been conducting due diligence research in this region for several months, Westbrook explained to the assembled officials. Our findings raised significant concerns about Lakeside's development practices, which is why we began exploring alternative approaches that would protect the watershed while still supporting appropriate economic development. He presented an overview of the conservation partnership proposed for the Miller Farm, expanding it into a regional vision that would maintain critical ecological functions while creating sustainable economic opportunities through ecotourism, agricultural tourism, and environmental education. Rather than fighting against the natural systems that make this area special, Westbrook concluded, we propose working with them to create a development model that enhances rather than degrades the unique character and ecological health of Evergreen Lake and its watershed. County Commissioner Helen Jacobs, who had long been concerned about the pace and nature of Lakeside's expansion, was the first to respond. This presents a dramatically different vision than what we've been working with under Lakeside's plans. How would existing development be integrated into this approach? Remediation and retrofit, Dr. Cho explained, displaying diagrams on the presentation screen. Existing structures would be modified with green infrastructure, impervious surfaces would be reduced, and natural drainage patterns would be restored wherever possible. The goal would be gradual transformation toward a more integrated and sustainable model. As the discussion continued, it became clear that Westbrook's alternative vision was gaining traction among local officials and landowners who had grown increasingly concerned about Lakeside's impact on the region's environmental health and community character. The revelation of deliberate environmental sabotage had broken whatever remaining trust existed. Thomas observed this shift with cautious optimism. The regional momentum toward Westbrook's approach would create a more supportive context for the conservation partnership he was considering for his own farm, potentially reducing future conflicts with neighboring land uses. The meeting was interrupted by the arrival of Richard Davis and a team of Lakeside attorneys. Davis appeared visibly stressed, his typically composed demeanor replaced by barely contained anger as he surveyed the room and noted Westbrook's presence. Lakeside Resort Properties categorically denies any illegal activities, Davis announced without preamble. The documents in question are either fabricated or represent unauthorized actions by former employees acting without corporate approval. The transparent desperation of this defense was not lost on anyone in the room. Environmental Protection Officer Janet Martinez responded coolly. The documents contain your personal authorizations and signatures, Mr. Davis. Digital forensics has already verified their authenticity. This isn't a matter for debate at this point. It's a matter for investigation and enforcement. Davis's attention fixed on Thomas. This is your doing, isn't it, Miller? Revenge because we wouldn't meet your unreasonable price demands. Before Thomas could respond, Westbrook intervened smoothly. "Mr. Davis, you're facing serious legal jeopardy. I'd advise against making unfounded accusations that could further complicate your position." The confrontation might have escalated further if not for the arrival of state law enforcement officials with a search warrant for Lakeside's offices and a court order freezing certain company assets pending investigation. Davis was escorted from the meeting to deal with these immediate legal challenges, his parting glare at Thomas promising that this conflict was far from resolved. As the meeting continued without Lakeside's representatives, the discussion turned to practical next steps. Environmental officials outlined immediate remediation requirements for existing contamination. Local government representatives began exploring regulatory changes that would support more sustainable development patterns. Landowners who had sold under duress formed an impromptu coalition to explore legal options for challenging those transactions. Throughout these discussions, Thomas noted how frequently participants turned to Westbrook for input and perspective. It was becoming increasingly clear that Westbrook Environmental Development was positioning itself not just as a potential business partner for his farm, but as the architect of a transformed vision for the entire region's future. When the meeting finally concluded late that afternoon, Thomas found himself walking to the parking lot alongside Westbrook. "That was quite a dramatic turn of events," Thomas observed. "Did you know about the whistleblower documents before today?" Westbrook's slight smile revealed nothing. "Let's just say we had reason to believe that Lakeside's practices wouldn't withstand careful scrutiny. Our company makes a point of thoroughly understanding the competitive landscape before proposing alternative approaches." The carefully worded response confirmed what Thomas had begun to suspect, that Westbrook's company had played a more active role in exposing Lakeside's misconduct than they were publicly acknowledging. Whether they had connections to the whistleblower or had conducted their own investigation that pressured someone inside Lakeside to act, the result was the same. Lakeside's position was now severely compromised, and Westbrook's alternative vision had gained significant momentum. "Where does this leave our potential partnership?" Thomas asked directly. "Stronger than before," Westbrook replied without hesitation. "The regional context now supports rather than conflicts with the conservation model we've proposed for your farm. With Lakeside's operations under legal scrutiny, there's an opportunity to establish a new development paradigm for the entire watershed, one that honors your family's legacy of stewardship rather than erasing it." As they reached their respective vehicles, Westbrook added, "The choice remains yours, Thomas. But I believe today's events have validated our approach rather dramatically. Sometimes the most sustainable path forward is also the most just." Driving home to the farm, Thomas reflected on how dramatically circumstances had shifted in just 2 weeks. From facing seemingly inevitable foreclosure and the loss of his family's legacy, he now stood at the center of a potential transformation that might preserve not just his own farm, but the ecological integrity of the entire watershed. What had begun with the simple act of helping a stranded traveler during a blizzard had catalyzed events that were now reshaping the future of Evergreen Lake and the communities that depended on it. The small choices, stopping to help a stranger, documenting environmental violations, refusing to sell despite financial pressure, had created ripples that were growing into waves of change. As Thomas turned onto the gravel road leading to the farmhouse his great-grandfather had built, he felt a profound sense of connection to the generations before him who had maintained this land through challenges they could never have anticipated. They had persevered not by fighting against change, but by adapting to it while preserving what was truly valuable. Now it was his turn to navigate a different kind of change, not weathering it as an unwelcome force, but potentially helping to guide it toward a future that honored rather than erased the past. The partnership with Westbrook offered not just survival, but the opportunity to demonstrate that environmental stewardship and economic viability could reinforce rather than conflict with each other. Thomas parked his truck beside the weathered barn that had sheltered equipment and harvests through more than a century of seasons. Tomorrow he would contact Westbrook and move forward with the partnership agreement, not just as a solution to his own challenges, but as part of a larger vision for what responsible development could become. What Thomas couldn't yet know was that the coming transformation would extend far beyond Evergreen Lake, eventually establishing a model that would influence how communities throughout the region approach the essential balance between development, agriculture, and environmental protection. The weathered farmer who had simply stopped to help a stranded traveler would find himself playing a pivotal role in redefining what progress could mean for rural communities facing pressures from conventional development. The small act of kindness during a blizzard had set in motion changes that would ripple outward, touching far more lives than Thomas Miller could possibly have imagined as he stood looking out at his snow-covered cranberry bogs just 2 weeks earlier. In helping a stranger, he had unknowingly opened the door to helping an entire watershed and the communities that depended on it. 5 years later, Thomas Miller stood on the observation platform overlooking his cranberry bogs during the fall harvest, watching as workers in chest waders corralled the floating berries within floating booms. The scene was timeless, the vibrant red fruit bobbing on the water's surface, the methodical movements of the harvest crew, the crisp autumn air carrying the tangy scent of ripe cranberries. Yet, surrounding this traditional harvest were elements that his great-grandfather could never have imagined. A small group of resort guests watched from a designated viewing area, cameras capturing the picturesque harvest, while a young guide, a local university student studying sustainable agriculture, explained the ecological benefits of the traditional wet harvesting method. Nearby, a class of elementary school children sketched the scene as part of an environmental education program, their teacher pointing out how the bogs connected to the larger watershed. The Living Watershed Experience sign at the trailhead, leading to the bogs, was tasteful and unobtrusive, crafted from locally sourced cedar with the Miller family farm logo prominently displayed alongside the smaller Westbrook Environmental Development emblem. The interpretive trail that wound through the property had been carefully designed to provide access without disrupting operations or sensitive habitats. "Still seems a bit surreal, doesn't it?" Rebecca asked, joining her father on the platform. Now the environmental director for the Evergreen Lake Watershed Restoration Project, she divided her time between scientific research and overseeing the implementation of sustainable practices throughout the region. Thomas nodded, taking in the harmonious blend of agricultural production, environmental protection, and educational tourism that his farm had become. "When I signed that partnership agreement 5 years ago, I couldn't have imagined all this. I was just hoping to save the farm." "You did more than save it," Rebecca said, pride evident in her voice. You transformed it into a model that's being replicated across the country. The transformation had not been without challenges. The first year after partnering with Westbrook Environmental Development had been particularly difficult as Lakeside Resort fought the criminal charges and environmental violations through every legal channel available. Richard Davis had made good on his implied threat, using his remaining influence to create obstacles for the new vision, challenging permits, filing lawsuits, and attempting to turn public opinion against what he characterized as anti-growth environmentalism. But the evidence against Lakeside had been too substantial to overcome. Faced with criminal indictments and civil penalties that threatened to bankrupt the company, Lakeside's board of directors had ultimately removed Davis and negotiated a settlement that included significant remediation requirements. When Westbrook Environmental subsequently acquired controlling interest in the restructured company, the path was cleared for implementing their integrated vision for the watershed. The Miller Farm had become the centerpiece of this new approach, a working demonstration that traditional agriculture, ecological protection, and thoughtful tourism could coexist and even enhance one another. The conservation easement permanently protected the wetlands and bogs from development, while the partnership provided capital for modernizing equipment, restoring historic structures, and establishing educational programs. Governors arriving tomorrow for the watershed restoration ceremony, Rebecca reminded Thomas. The press coverage will be extensive. The governor's visit would officially recognize the completion of the 5-year Evergreen Lake watershed restoration project, an ambitious effort that had transformed how water moved through the regional landscape. Damaged wetlands had been restored, shorelines replanted with native vegetation, and green infrastructure installed to filter runoff from existing development. The lake's water quality had improved dramatically, reversing decades of degradation. James called this morning, Thomas said, referring to Westbrook, who had become not just a business partner but a friend over the past 5 years. The Environmental Education Center has received federal certification. We're officially a nationally recognized demonstration site for agricultural environmental integration. The Education Center, housed in the beautifully restored historic barn, welcomed thousands of visitors annually, from school children learning basic ecology to university researchers studying sustainable agricultural methods to developers from other regions seeking to understand the Westbrook model of integrated development. What had once been a struggling family farm fighting for survival was now an internationally recognized example of how traditional agriculture could thrive while enhancing rather than degrading natural systems. Did you ever imagine this outcome? When you pulled James's SUV out of that snowdrift? Rebecca asked with a smile. Thomas shook his head. I was just doing what needed to be done, helping someone in trouble. My concerns didn't extend beyond making the next mortgage payment and keeping the farm going for one more season. That simple act of kindness during a blizzard had catalyzed a transformation far beyond the boundaries of the Miller farm. The Evergreen model, as it had come to be known in planning and development circles, had fundamentally shifted how the region approached the balance between economic development, agricultural heritage, and environmental protection. The resort that had once represented a threat to the watershed was now its most prominent champion, with sustainability integrated into every aspect of its operations. Guests came specifically to experience the unique combination of luxury accommodations, and authentic connections to the natural environment and agricultural traditions. The premium they willingly paid for this experience generated the revenue that funded ongoing conservation and restoration efforts throughout the watershed. As Thomas and Rebecca watched the harvest continue below, a familiar black Tesla turned into the farm's entrance road. James Westbrook had arrived early for tomorrow's ceremony, as was his habit, preferring to spend time walking the land and connecting with the people who made the projects work, rather than simply appearing for the official events. "Thomas, Rebecca," he called as he approached the observation platform. At 62, Westbrook remained energetic and hands-on, personally involved in each of his company's showcase projects. "The harvest looks magnificent. Best yield in a decade," Thomas confirmed with the measured pride of a farmer who knew better than to celebrate too enthusiastically before the crop was safely processed. "The new irrigation system is proving its worth, and the wetland enhancements have improved water quality significantly." Westbrook nodded approvingly. "The satellite imagery confirms it. The entire watershed is showing dramatic improvement in all key ecological indicators." He turned to Rebecca. "Your research team's latest report is creating quite a stir in policy circles. 3 state legislatures are now considering legislation based on the Evergreen model. Rebecca's research documenting the economic and environmental benefits of the integrated approach had become influential beyond anything she had initially imagined. What had begun as a local effort to protect one watershed had evolved into a template for regional planning that balanced development pressures with ecological functionality and agricultural preservation. "The governor's bringing the Commerce Secretary tomorrow," Westbrook continued. "They're looking at establishing a federal grant program to help other communities implement similar watershed-based planning approaches." As the 3 walked from the observation platform toward the processing facility, they passed a tour group learning about the farm's history and ecological significance. The guide, a young man who had grown up in the community, was explaining how the partnership between the Miller family and Westbrook Environmental had created a new paradigm for rural development. Before this partnership, the region faced a false choice between environmental protection and economic development, the guide was saying. The Miller farm demonstrated that working with natural systems rather than against them creates more sustainable economic outcomes while preserving ecological functions and cultural heritage. Thomas smiled at hearing the farm's story told this way, not as a desperate last stand against inevitable development, but as a pioneering example of a better approach to balancing human needs with environmental realities. The narrative had shifted from conflict to collaboration, from resistance to innovation. Inside the processing facility, modernized equipment hummed efficiently as cranberries moved through cleaning, sorting, and packaging processes. The Miller Family Farm brand, with its emphasis on organic certification and ecological stewardship, now commanded premium prices in specialty markets nationwide. The farm employed 3 times as many people as it had 5 years earlier, creating jobs that combined agricultural traditions with modern sustainability practices. "Remember when you worried this partnership might be too good to be true?" Westbrook asked Thomas as they watched the operation. Thomas nodded, recalling his initial skepticism. "I'd seen too many failed promises and corporate buyouts to believe there was really a different way forward. And now the Miller farm is showing thousands of visitors each year that there is indeed a better way." Westbrook observed. That economic viability doesn't have to come at the expense of environmental, health, or cultural heritage. As they continued their tour of the property, they passed the original farmhouse, now beautifully restored and serving as both Thomas's home and a small museum showcasing the history of cranberry cultivation in the region. Adjacent to it stood the farm-to-table restaurant that served resort guests and the public, creating another revenue stream that supported the farm's operations while educating visitors about sustainable food systems. The school groups are my favorite, Thomas admitted as they watched a class of middle school students engaging in a wetland sampling activity led by one of Rebecca's research assistants. Seeing young people connect with the land, understanding where food comes from and how natural systems work, that feels like the most important legacy. It's remarkable how children intuitively grasp the interconnections that we adults often fragment into separate domains. Economy, environment, community, Westbrook observed. They see the whole system naturally. As evening approached, they gathered on the farmhouse porch with several other key figures in the watershed restoration project for an informal dinner before the next day's official ceremonies. The group included Helen Jacobs, now in her second term as county commissioner, Dr. Elaine Cho, whose scientific guidance had been instrumental in designing the restoration approaches, and Michael Patel, whose financial models had demonstrated the economic advantages of the integrated approach. The conversation flowed easily among people who had worked closely together through challenges and successes over the past 5 years. They shared stories of initial skepticism overcome, unexpected obstacles navigated, and moments when the project's ultimate success had seemed uncertain. I remember when the first quarterly economic report was released after we began implementation, Commissioner Jacobs recalled. The traditional development interests predicted economic collapse without Lakeside's original expansion plans. Instead, we saw increases in property values, tourism revenue, and even construction jobs, just directed toward restoration and sustainable building rather than conventional development. Dr. Cho nodded agreement. The data has been our strongest advocate. When people see that watershed health directly correlates with economic indicators like property values, tourism spending, and even public health metrics, the old arguments about environment versus economy lose their power. As darkness fell, the group moved to the fire pit behind the farmhouse, another gathering space that hosted everything from scientific discussions to community celebrations. The flames cast a warm glow on faces that showed the satisfaction of people who had collaboratively created something meaningful and lasting. I've been thinking about what made the Evergreen model succeed, where so many other attempts at sustainable development have fallen short, Rebecca said, accepting a mug of homemade apple cider. I think it's because we started with what was already here and valuable. The natural systems, the agricultural traditions, the community connections, rather than trying to impose an entirely new vision. Adaptive rather than extractive. Development, Westbrook agreed, working with the existing natural and cultural capital instead of replacing it. Thomas added another log to the fire, watching the sparks rise into the clear night sky. My grandfather used to say that good. Farming means leaving the land better than you found it. I think we've extended that principle beyond the farm boundaries to the entire watershed. The conversation turned to the future, the next phases of implementation, the research questions still to be explored, the policy changes needed to support similar approaches in other regions. Despite the challenges that remained, there was a shared confidence born of demonstrated success. The Evergreen Lake watershed had become living proof that economic development could enhance rather than degrade ecological health and community character. Later that night, after the guests had departed, Thomas stood alone on the porch of the farmhouse his great-grandfather had built, looking out over the land that 4 generations of his family had stewarded. The moon illuminated the landscape. Neither the wetlands and bogs that filtered water flowing to the lake, the restored native vegetation along the boundaries, the educational facilities that shared this legacy with visitors from around the world. 5 years earlier, he had faced the seemingly inevitable loss of everything his family had built over more than a century. Now, through a partnership that had grown from a chance encounter during a blizzard, the farm was not only secured for future generations, but had become the catalyst for regional transformation. The following morning dawned clear and crisp, perfect weather for the watershed restoration ceremony. By mid-morning, the designated ceremony area near the shores of Evergreen Lake was filled with attendees ranging from local residents to state officials, environmental advocates to business leaders. Media crews set up cameras to capture what had become a nationally significant example of innovative environmental economic integration. Thomas stood somewhat uncomfortably in the front row, never having fully adjusted to the public attention the project had brought. Beside him, Rebecca was reviewing her speaking notes, while nearby James Westbrook chatted easily with the governor and other dignitaries. The ceremony began with traditional acknowledgements and introductions, but quickly moved to the substance of what had been accomplished. Digital displays showed before and after imagery of the watershed, documenting the transformation from degraded systems to restored ecological functionality. Speakers highlighted not just the environmental improvements, but the economic benefits: increased tourism revenue, new jobs in restoration and sustainable agriculture, rising property values, and improved quality of life measures. When it was Thomas's turn to speak, he approached the podium with the straightforward manner that had made him an unexpectedly effective ambassador for the project. Rather than delivering a formal address, he simply shared the story of his family's connection to the land, the crisis he had faced 5 years earlier, and the unexpected opportunity that had arisen from helping a stranded traveler during a blizzard. What began as a simple act of neighborly assistance during a snowstorm led to conversations that revealed shared values despite our different backgrounds, Thomas explained. James Westbrook and I discovered that we both believed in the fundamental principle that true progress enhances what's valuable rather than destroying it. He gestured toward the restored shoreline and the healthier, clearer waters of Evergreen Lake. This project succeeded because it built upon what was already here and worth preserving: the natural filtration systems of wetlands, the agricultural practices refined over generations, the community connections to land and water. Rather than erasing these assets in the name of development, the Evergreen model demonstrated how they could become the foundation for a more sustainable prosperity. As Thomas concluded his remarks, the audience response reflected the broad support the project had earned across previously divided constituencies. Environmental advocates applauded, alongside business owners, farmers alongside resort staff, long-time residents alongside newcomers, attracted by the region's innovative approach. The governor's address emphasized how the Evergreen model was influencing state policy, creating frameworks that encouraged similar watershed-based planning throughout the region. What began here as a local effort to balance competing interests has evolved into a template for how we can approach development in the 21st century, he noted. Not as a zero-sum conflict between environment and economy, but as an opportunity to create prosperity precisely by protecting and enhancing the natural systems that sustain us. Following the ceremony, Thomas found himself speaking with a young farmer who had traveled from several states away to learn about the Evergreen model. The young man faced similar pressures on his family's farm: development encroaching, financial challenges mounting, traditional agricultural practices increasingly difficult to maintain. Before seeing what you've accomplished here, I thought our only options were to sell out or go under fighting a losing battle, the young farmer admitted. But this shows there's another path forward, one that honors traditional agricultural values while adapting to new realities. Thomas recognized in the younger man's situation echoes of his own desperate circumstances 5 years earlier. The key was finding partners who valued what we already knew was important: the functioning ecological systems, the agricultural knowledge built over generations, the connections between land and community. Those aren't liabilities to be discarded in the name of progress. They're assets to build upon. As the young farmer asked detailed questions about how the partnership worked, Thomas reflected on how his perspective had evolved. What had begun as a desperate effort to save his own farm had become something much larger, a demonstration that alternatives existed to the seemingly inevitable loss of agricultural land and environmental degradation in the face of development pressures. Later that afternoon, Thomas found a quiet moment with James Westbrook as the festivities continued around them. "Did you have any idea what you were starting when you got your SUV stuck in that snowdrift?" Thomas asked with a smile. Westbrook laughed. "I knew our company was looking for a demonstration site for our integrated approach, but I couldn't have predicted how perfectly your farm would serve that purpose or how effectively this community would embrace the vision." "It almost didn't happen," Thomas reminded him. "If I hadn't stopped to help you that day, if we hadn't had those conversations during the blizzard, if you hadn't recognized the potential in what most people saw as just another struggling farm." "But you did stop," Westbrook said simply. "That's often how meaningful change begins, not with grand strategies, but with individuals making choices that reflect their values. You chose to help a stranger despite your own troubles. That choice opened possibilities that weren't visible before." As the sun began to set over Evergreen Lake, its waters now clearer than they had been in decades, its shores restored to ecological functionality, its watershed protected by a new approach to development, Thomas Miller stood with his daughter, watching visitors experience the interconnected natural and agricultural systems that their family had helped preserve. What had begun as a desperate farmer helping a stranded businessman during a snowstorm had evolved into a transformation that extended far beyond the boundaries of the Miller farm. The small choices to stop and help, to listen and learn, to stand firm for values when easier paths beckoned, to imagine possibilities beyond the seemingly inevitable conflicts, had collectively created a new reality that honored both human needs and natural systems. The Evergreen model would continue to evolve, facing new challenges and opportunities in the years ahead. but it had already demonstrated a profound truth that was changing how communities approach development throughout the region. That prosperity need not come at the expense of the natural systems and cultural heritage that give places their unique value. By honoring what was already valuable, by working with natural systems rather than against them, by bridging traditional divides between environment and economy, a more sustainable and equitable future was possible. As evening fell and the celebration continued around them, Thomas and Rebecca Miller stood on the shores of the lake their family had helped protect for over a century, now secured for generations yet to come through a partnership that had begun with a simple act of kindness during a blizzard. In helping a stranded traveler, Thomas had unknowingly opened the door to helping an entire watershed, creating ripples of positive change that would continue expanding long after that snowstorm had become a distant memory. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.